All right. So, for anybody who's actually here paying attention and watching my second video, the first video kind of give you a quick glimpse into who I am. Round two is going to be about the subject matter of the overall purpose to making these videos. So, I'm going to go over what I consider to be Alcohol 101. We're going to start with what is alcohol. So, the alcohol that goes into adult beverages is ethanol, and that's produced by fermentation. And fermentation is the process by which yeast consume sugar and then metabolize it and produce out as their byproduct CO2, alcohol in the form of ethanol, and heat. Different yeasts all do this differently, and you would expect to get different product as a result of different yeast being used. The primary yeast that we see for use in human consumption of alcoholic products is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which, if the name cerevisiae sounds like another word you might be familiar with, the Spanish word for beer is cerveza. They are related. And so all forms of alcohol are derivative from that from that initial fermentation. So any type of sugar can be used to produce alcohol. Now, when it comes down to it, that's sort of the determining factor for what type of alcoholic beverage you're going to get. When you just ferment grain, and there's a whole bunch of different grains, and then you don't go any further with it, you get beer. When you're fermenting just fruit juice, generally speaking, that's referred to as a wine or a cider, depending on which type of fruit you're using as the base. Fermented agave juice is referred to as pulque. Fermented rice, which is a grain, and we can get into that. We'll get into that in greater detail during a different episode. It becomes sake. Fermented tea leaves. Fermented tea, actually, not just tea leaves, but tea itself becomes kombucha, and fermented honey becomes mead. And then we have a choice to make. Once you've built a fermented product, if you want to make a distilled product or a spirit, then you're going to go through another chemical conversion process. This time, instead of a standard sort of naturally occurring metabolic process, you're going to take the fermented juice, whatever it is, and you're going to heat it. Alcohol has a lower boiling point than water, so when you're heating a fermented liquid to the point of boiling the water, you will boil the ethanol out first. And somewhere thousands of years ago, somebody figured out that got them more drunk. Anyway, so distillation also helps remove the impurities from the water. So by forcing everything to be boiled out, you actually wind up with a relatively pure vapor. That vapor then can be forced through a condenser neck and then cooled, and as it cools, it reconverts from gas back into a liquid state. You can collect the liquid, and then based on what you're starting with, you're going to get a different type of spirit at the end of it. The impurities that I was referring to when one is distilling a fermented product to turn it into a distilled beverage are called congeners. Congeners basically refer to anything that isn't the actual ethanol or water base, and so you can wind up with all kinds of different things that actually really determine the flavor of the finished product, and that's part of the point here. Also, generally speaking, depending on how many times you're going to distill, you're not going to remove all of the water, nor are you going to remove all of the congeners. It's not a perfect system, but you'll wind up becoming increasingly closer to purity the more you distill it. So if you start with the first run and it gets you to, say, 85% pure, then the second run gets you to 91% pure, and so on and so forth. Those aren't exact numbers. There are some exact numbers that I'll get into in greater detail when I'm talking specifically about distilled spirits. But anyway, so once you've taken one of your original fermented products and decided that you're going to distill it, you then wind up in one of the categories of distilled spirits. And really, there's only 5 of these. People make arguments for a 6th or 7th, but those are really derivative of the originals. So we're going to talk about vodka, which is effectively distilled neutral grain spirit. So you start with a beer, you distill it, you get vodka. Now, if you take that vodka and you age it in oak, then you're probably making a whiskey. And it could be that you're using barley as your grain base. And if that's the case, you're probably making Scotch or Japanese whiskey. If you're using corn as your base, you're probably making bourbon or Tennessee whiskey. If you're making rye, Canadian whiskey or rye whiskey, whichever way you prefer to go. So there's that. And then if you're using fruit juice and you're distilling it, that's almost always going to be brandy. Mezcal is the derivative of, or the distilled version of pulque. So you wind up with mezcal or more specific types like tequila, raicilla, and bacanora, which are based on different species of agave, different preparation techniques. And then rum is usually what we use sugarcane juice to eventually distill into rum. Gin is classified as a separate spirit, but it's really more of like a botanical aromatized vodka, if you want to think about it that way. And then liqueurs and cordials are again often brandies or occasionally vodkas that have been flavored with any number of things afterward, and often there are sugars added or bitters added to make an aperitif or a digestif. So there's that. The other thing I want to address in this initial conversation is that alcohol isn't just used for adult beverages, though that is probably the number one consumed use. Anyway, it's definitely my favorite use. It can also be used as a hand sanitizer. The chemical properties of ethanol make it so that it is actually a very strong antimicrobial. We can use the mash that we've used to produce the fermented good as feed for livestock. In fact, that's probably the number one use for that mash. Once it's actually got the alcohol, it should not be used as a fertilizer. Any sugars that are in there can often actually drive fungal and microbial growth more than the ethanol would counter it. So don't pour beer on your plants. That's not really going to help. A, it's alcohol abuse. B, it's not really going to help make your plants grow. It can help cattle in the case of Wagyu beef. Anyway, and then the other thing that everybody needs to be aware of is that alcohol does have some very strong deleterious effects on your health over the course of time. It is possible to overdose on alcohol, though the amount of alcohol one has to consume is pretty insane. Effectively, if you're a bartender or a server, and that's sort of the purpose to making a Preshift video like this, the primary function of alcohol in the system is in the human system is that it acts as a depressant in the central nervous system. Effectively, that leads to reduced inhibitions and then reduced judgment, eventually motor control, and then if you drink too much too quickly very rapidly, you can actually depress your own respiration, leading to a coma potentially or death. So it's definitely super important to make sure that you're keeping an eye on people. Not only are they probably going to make a worse decision if they're driving, but there's also the possibility that they could pass out and die. Anyway, that wraps up Preshift Alcohol 101. The next version that I'll be releasing, hopefully in the next few days, will be directly related to those fermented beverage alcohols. I'll get a little bit more in depth, spend 10 minutes on that, and then we'll get another, and then I'll go into each of them individually as their own little sub show. Anyway, have a great shift tonight. Hope everybody's well.